We have somehow stumbled into the most volatile geopolitical posture on earth, not through necessity, not through an unavoidable chain of events, but through a cascade of ego and bravado and the kind of reckless certainty that's usually reserved for men who've never had to carry the consequences of their own decisions. And we're being told with a straight face that this is strength, that threatening the collapse of an entire society is somehow leverage. We're stacking war crimes on top of war crimes and calling it strategy. This is the natural conclusion of putting unserious men in serious rooms and then acting surprised when they treat the world like it's Bourbon Street. And somewhere along the line, a man who carries himself like a half-read pundit with a glass full of shit whiskey and a microphone decided that regime change was a weekend project, that geopolitics could be reduced to a bar bet. A womanizing, whiskey-soaked piece of shit failure with no real military leadership experience was made Secretary of Defense, and then he decided that he could bulldoze decades of regional complexity with the same confidence he uses to mispronounce it, and no one stopped him. Not one adult in the room stood up and said, "You have no idea what the fuck you're talking about," and instead the performance is allowed to continue. This bluff was mistaken for confidence. The volume was mistaken for authority. The kind of man who confuses his ass with a wristwatch was handed influence over decisions that require precision, discipline, and the humility to know what you don't know, which in this case appears to be goddamn everything. So now we have ultimatums delivered like last calls and timelines that are pulled from thin air, and threats that are so cartoonishly oversized that they sound like they were written by someone who thinks that war is something that only happens on TV. That we can do it in 48 hours. Well, of course you can. And I can shit diamonds if we're measuring success in sentences instead of reality. This is the level of thinking we've elevated. This is the new Trump standard. And when the fantasy collides with reality, when Iran doesn't fold on cue, when the world refuses to behave accordingly to the expectations of men who have never been forced to revise their own assumptions, what do we get? We get escalation. Not strategy, not recalibration, escalation. Because admitting you were wrong requires a level of maturity that is apparently in very short supply. Much shorter supply than missiles. So instead of course correcting, we double down. We inflate the language. They've gone from "we've got this under control" to "a whole civilization will die tonight," as if turning the volume knob all the way to the right somehow compensates for the fact that nobody bothered to read the goddamn handbook. And the part that's sitting on top of the global powder keg is that there is still no objective. None. Not a fucking thing. No defined end state, no measurable success criteria, no coherent explanation for what happens after the dust settles. And assuming anyone involved is still interested in something as trivial as after, just a vague chest-thumping insistence that this is necessary or important or decisive, this is the geopolitical equivalent of a man insisting he knows where he's going while missing every goddamn exit on the way. And we're supposed to take this seriously? We're supposed to believe that threatening the collapse of an entire civilization is some rational response to an economic and strategic situation which we ignited in the first place. That this is about security, that this is about stability, that this is about anything other than a catastrophic refusal to admit that the initial premise was deeply and horribly flawed. There is no credible existential threat to the United States being articulated to justify this level of rhetoric. Not one. What there is, though, is a fragile ego and a personality structure that cannot tolerate the idea of being wrong. And the cost will be very fucking real. Now, not for the men making these decisions from their well-lit rooms and new leather chairs, not for the ones treating this like a performance of strength. The cost will land exactly where it always does, on the people who will be told to pay more and endure more and sacrifice more. The people who will be handed the bill for someone else's arrogance and told that it's patriotism. But the cost will be generational, and it will be visited on our children and grandchildren. Our economy will suffer in ways that few living Americans have ever seen. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is watching this unfold like a slow-motion demonstration of how credibility evaporates. Allies recalibrating, enemies taking notes, markets bracing for impact. And at the center of it all, the United States sounding more and more like a man arguing with himself on a street corner. Because once you start talking about civilizations as disposable, you've already told everyone listening that your ceiling is gone, that restraint is now optional, and that escalation is just another tool in the box. And when that becomes your language, it doesn't matter whether you intend to follow through. The damage is done. You've made yourself unpredictable in the worst possible way. Unpredictability isn't strength, it's just instability, just regular old instability. So now we're headed toward the logical conclusion of letting fragile egos write checks that reality has to cash now, toward a situation where backing down feels like the only responsible option left, toward a moment when someone somewhere is going to have to decide whether preserving their pride is worth risking consequences that they do not understand. And if pride goeth before the fall, may they fall far and hard, and may they never fucking recover. History is littered with men who believed they were in control right up until the moment they found out they weren't. The only difference here is that the stakes are higher, the language is louder, and the margin for error is effectively zero. And if this is what passes for strategic thinking, if this is the caliber of judgment guiding decisions that could destroy the world in a matter of hours, then the question isn't whether this is dangerous. The question is why anyone is still pretending that it isn't inevitable. God damn these fragile men. Define still death.